right, so I'm going to talk today a little bit about The Northman. That is Robert Eggers' third movie after The Witch and the Lighthouse, and his most expensive movie out of the three. So basically, this movie is a pounding, brutal Viking revenge tale rooted in the Scandinavian folk legend of Amleth. It is led by the Swedish actor Alexander Skarsgård as an exiled Icelandic prince out to avenge his father's murder and reclaim his kingdom. And it has pretty much all the blood and muscle you can possibly associate with the genre, plus an ensemble including Nicole Kidman as Amlet's mother, Ethan Hawke as his father, Anya Taylor-Joy as his love interest, and Claes Bank as his uncle. There is even a cameo from the Icelandic pop deity Björk, her first film in many years, I reckon. So the film boasts a rich historical idiom, rampant spirituality, and ambiguous heroism. And in order for us to understand better what it is about, I am going to try to present a little bit the context as in why Robert Eggers chose this topic after all. So Robert Eggers is himself the son of a Shakespeare professor. He was passionate about Conan the Barbarian, for example, as a child. He used to love comic books, and then that gave way to more esoteric interests, for example, the Renaissance, and then the engravings of Albrecht Dürer. His other two movies, I'm not sure if you've seen them or not, The Witch and the Lighthouse, do have this tendency of engaging a lot with this very charged spiritual, supernatural atmosphere. And I think he was attempting to do something similar in this movie as well. The idea came to him, and I'm going to quote here from an article in The Guardian. So he says that the macho stereotype of that history, the Viking history, along with, the right-wing misappropriation of Viking culture, made me sort of allergic to it, and I just never wanted to go there. So that was his initial thought. But his attitude shifted on a vacation to Iceland. He was very much impressed by the landscapes, which he described as being incredibly inspiring and prehistorical. And he also had some meetings with Björk on the one hand, and then with the famous Icelandic poet and novelist Sjón. So he attempted to make a more religious experience out of this Viking age, to turn it a little bit into something a little more metaphysical than the classical epics, which I already said he wasn't really keen on. How much he succeeds in doing this is a completely different story. All right, so I am going to these are the movies I mentioned before. So The Witch, if you haven't seen them, is about some Puritans experiencing some sort of sorcery and supernatural while trying to live in an isolated community. And his other movie is The Lighthouse. It is about two Welsh tower keepers experiencing in their turn some kind of visions. And before I continue with this, I would like to draw the attention upon some theoretical considerations about media in general, and which I also consider to be helpful when discussing not only Viking movies, but medievalistic movies in general. And some of these theoretical approaches I've also used here. So my idea would be that when tackling the Middle Ages on screen, you basically create a shared cultural repository of symbols. And I'm going to quote Umberto Eco here: every new invention, so every new code, sets off a chain reaction and produces some sort of common language. So basically, all these aspects and elements we see in not only Viking movies, but medievalistic movies in general, have to have some kind of recognizability. Otherwise, they wouldn't be understood or perceived by the audience. So no text is read in isolation. All reading occurs within frameworks of intertextuality, or as Andrew Eliot defines it, we have a loosely affiliated array of ideas linked not only to a common purpose, but also by hyperlinks. So all kinds of references to not only medieval sources, but other movies as well. All right, and then we can also add that medievalistic media is both a product and a contributor to mythography. So basically what is being created is a new mythology, a customized version of the past, which remains recognizable and meaningful, but that is not to say that the modes of narrativization cannot be modified, or that the Middle Ages cannot be used to contradictory purposes. And when discussing a medievalistic movie, I also found useful the three steps that Andrew Elliott proposed, which is first the historical expropriation, that is the context of the appearance of a certain movie, for example, and then we have the retransmission, so that refers to the flattening out of the symbols, how symbols are used and reused or misused, and then lastly we have the ideological modification. So if a film, for example, brings some kind of innovation or other concerns, maybe religious concerns, political concerns, and so on, and how it is grafted onto modernity, basically. Now, with regard to Vikings in particular, overall, the medieval imaginary of the Vikings has been between a grotesque age consisting of excessive violence, disease, and death, and dirtiness overall. And on the other hand, we have this romantic, picturesque fantasy of knights in shining armor. And often an image is developed as a combination of several ideas, which can be classified as a fundamental dualism. I mean by this that both the negative and the positive can function together. This is, of course, always in relation to what the audience expects. Multiple Middle Ages can be created depending on the mediated iconography as well as collective memories. And Viking mythography revolves around this duality between barbarian and heroes. And this goes way, way back to the 1955 movie as the perpetrators of chaos, and up to the series Vikings, where they become these romanticized heathen figures, attempting to present civilization as a whole and a reversal of the trope of the civilizing Christianity and the barbarian heathen. However, whether positive or negative, they must always be exceptional. So the myth of exceptionalism is something I would say characterizes Viking movies overall. And this is heavily influenced by the nostalgia after heroes of the past, heroes of the mythical Nordic past, the poetic Edda, for example, and they are being endowed with all these virtues and talents from courage and a sense of duty, which are often felt to be lacking in the modern age. So there is this strange mix of trying to revive the past with some concerns about the present. So overall, there has been, in the past years at least, an attempt to overcome this image of the uncivilized other and to present the characters as also having moral conflicts. Nevertheless, despite these attempts, there are a lot of the old codes have been preserved. The figure of the Viking often represents a very specific form of masculinity, one that encompasses notions of violence, dominance, other aggressive traits. But on the other hand, we also have it as a more nebulous figure, as mythology shows itself to be quite flexible to the obsessions and requirements of the individual, the race, the age. At any rate, exceptionalism is what seems to characterize them. So there is this interplay between otherness, foreignness, and then familiarity. So the figure of the Viking has to be something recognizable, but that does allow some kind of modification as well. So on the one hand, we have a glorification of these delights of paganism, epic slaughter, heroism, excessive disorder. This can also be interpreted as a form of escapism. Then we should also remember that we have, regarding the Viking Age, different layers of interpretation which date back to the sagas themselves. So the sagas written in the 13th, 14th, 15th century in Iceland, and then all these layers overlapping with the Victorian Age, for example, and the nationalistic period, and the racist reception of the Viking Age in the 20th and 21st century, after all. So different layers of reception coming one after the other. What I have noticed as some kind of new orientation with these new series. So the three pictures you can see in the lowercase, they're from 13th Warrior, the series Vikings, and a film called Valhalla Rising, is this attempt of trying at least to present some bits of mentality and not only focusing on what they do. So these epic adventures, which were actually what movies from the 50s and 60s focused on. All right, so coming back to this film, it does have a historical skeleton, so to speak. We have as a framework the story from Saxo Grammaticus. It's the story of Amleth, upon which Shakespeare's Hamlet is also based. But the story has been modified, so I'm not going to go into detail here. But perhaps one of the most important elements is the fact that the prince is not turning insane or stupid as he was initially, but he's turning into a berserker after his uncle kills his father. I also need to say that the story Saxo is telling us is much more complex than what the movie is providing. So the movie basically adopted this general pattern of a revenge tale with very few nuanced elements, I might say. Other sources include, well, a bunch of sagas. Robert Eggers actually took a lot of elements directly from the sagas, and no wonder he did that. He also had the help of two Old Norse scholars for that, Neil Price and Johanna Friedrichsdottir, who helped him reconstruct, or at least attempt to reconstruct, the age. So, for example, the idea of the magical sword is taken directly from this one, just one example, the saga of King Hrolf Kraki. Then he has the fight with the undead. Again, something you can find quite ad literam in the saga of Grettir the Strong. Then again, we also need to remember that these motifs have already been engaged with in other films as well. So he's not really inventing everything, but just trying to make it a little more believable. What he's attempting to do is to transfer all this material on the screen, and he wants us to regard this film as a proper saga. Which results in, well, this aura of factuality. It's a very immersive universe that he creates, but there is also a lot of hyper-realism involved, in the sense that there is this impression of weirdness, of the bizarre throughout the whole movie. Further on, I'm going to be discussing a little bit about what he's doing with material culture, and then with spirituality, and then about masculinity. So a new sense of realism is being offered here. The attention to detail is absolutely superb. So he uses all kinds of elements from the archaeological record and from the sagas as well to create this immersive universe. He has halls with all kinds of interesting details, scented pillars, hung fires, jesters, all these little details which add tremendously to a general sense of the age you don't really see in many other films. It's a very engaging universe, and it does not look artificial. However, it was darkened on purpose. The original pictures were much more colorful. The gloominess is part of the stereotype of medievalism, after all. On the other hand, you have a lot of other elements adding to this historical realism. I mean here the clothing, for example. You have riveted chainmails, penannular pins, patterned textiles, the use of helmets, and so on and so forth. Of course, the question remains as to how much of this really matters to the audience, say, without such a profound knowledge of the archaeology of the Viking Age. Now, this raises the question of accuracy, which is now left aside, in the sense of whether authenticity does help build a bridge between historical consciousness developing from scholarly work and the one resulting from popular engagements with the past. Then, of course, there is the question of relevance. I think it does help, at least it draws our attention to the fact that entertainment should also be an educational opportunity and not only remain as entertainment, or at least that was his approach here. Another novelty of the film, which I personally really liked because it was different from what I've seen before, is the representation of the sacred, and of the sacred not in the sense of this eternal fight between Christianity and heathenism, which I've noticed is quite the trope in Viking representation representation nowadays, but it is truly a heathen universe with no reference to any other kind of mentality. So we are in a universe without clear boundaries between reality and myth, which is again quite close to how ancient peoples would have imagined the world, populated by all sorts of either benevolent or evil spirits and driven by a fatalistic concept of fate, which transpires from multiple sources, starting with the closest one, with the poetic Edda. There is a lot of imaginative potential here, since sources about rituals are missing. And here I think such a movie could shine, because it could get one thinking at least about what a Viking way might have looked like. So he tries to reconstruct, for example, how the Berserkir would have acted and looked like. So these were these legendary warriors depicted in the sagas, but there are also some pieces of evidence that this might indeed have been a cult linked to Odin, even in the pre-Viking Age time. It is not very clear. I was a little bit unsatisfied with the fact that he chose to present them, but this is again a reiteration of the classical stereotype, to present them as naked and very well built. So they basically look photoshopped. This was not what they would have looked like in the age, and most definitely the most widely accepted linguistic explanation is that they were actually wearing bear skins, but that's just a little detail out of it. So you have, for example, here on the right side, these are the Torslunda plates. They are pre-Viking, and they hint to the existence of such a community. The film also deals quite lovely with the idea of shamanistic practices, sorcery, and so on and so forth. There is also an example of a sorcerer here, who, by the way, is one piece of evidence that the movie is not really that masculine, because he uses this little detail in the sense that in the sagas, for example, and in mythology in general, sorcerers were considered to be effeminate. So this activity comes with the price. It was considered to be a mark of ergi, that is of homosexuality, to engage with such activity. Nevertheless, they are so the sorcerer is depicted quite beautifully on screen. This is not the only instance of the supernatural in the film. You also have a prophetess, a Volva. You also have a Valkyria, with again all kinds of details to add up to this immersive universe. The feather skin used by the Valkyria, for example, and the blindness of the Volva. That's two more elements added to that. One more thing he uses is the Draugr, so the fight with the undead, and even the way the battle ends is taken directly from the saga. So he really does seem to care a lot about all these details. Which brings us to the final question of whether the way the hero is depicted is a twist on heroism or not. So I think that the classical duality regarding this masculinized Viking age is actually respected in the film, in the sense that we have both a hero and a barbarian. There's not very much we can make of him, but he does have this trait of exceptionalism. So he does make use of this trope. But the trope might be the point here, to overuse it on purpose. So as Amleth is not playing the role of the fool, but he is a berserker. He has an aggressive form of madness. He is basically the peak of Western hypermasculinity. But as a character overall, he is weighed down severely by his story, because he's one-sided. He has no development. He's driven by his instinct, and very importantly, by fate. So it's not really a masculinity he chooses. It's also very much related to this old concept of fatalism from all the Germanic religion. So he's not really made to be likable throughout the movie. His story is very linear and basically respects the tropes from Old Norse literature in a very general sense. So I can think that the film can be seen as a comment on hypermasculinity. So you can interpret the savagery as an escapist thrill, but also as a comment on toxic masculinity. There is a lot of ambiguity here. So the model presented is not really to be followed, but to be contemplated. There are scenes with these berserkers, for example, attacking innocent people and killing them for absolutely no reason. So there is a revival of traditional masculine tropes, but not necessarily as just one more example of them, but it can also be drawn to this idea of the alienating narrowness of contemporary masculinity. However, I do believe that not everyone can see the subtlety of this cinematic commentary. This is basically because of the storyline. So I think that the revenge storyline is determined by tradition and expectation. It's probably one of the oldest plots in cinematic history, and this is hampering its potential. It's a very simplistic story without nuance, and while a public from the 13th century Iceland could have dealt with it, I don't think a modern audience, I don't think it delivers for a modern audience, because it is extremely predictable and it is extremely linear. And the last aspect, which would speak against a use of, this overrated, overstated masculinity, would be the fact that women in this film do seem to have some kind of agency. They are manipulative and cunning, and they do manage to deal in their own way with the men in their lives. So as a conclusion, is it just another berserker on screen? Well, yes and no. I would agree that it is a part of a larger Viking mythography. And we do have this trope, this code of an interplay of something familiar with something unfamiliar, particularly this bizarre supernatural universe. And I would say as a conclusion that it is both a product and a contributor to Viking medievalism. It definitely has some parts where it shines through the depiction of the material heritage, for example, and through the depiction of Viking mentality. However, like I said before, I do find the lack of nuance of the narrative of the story itself as being quite limitative. So that was my contribution for today. A few books I used, generally speaking, about film, media, medievalism, and many thanks to you for listening.
Thank you, Irina.